Thank you everyone for joining. This is the first meeting of this month for the virtual DBA chapter. As you can see, we have our meetup link. We also have a LinkedIn group and our email address is posted. So in case if you want to give us any feedback, reach out to us with this email. We do monitor this. We do meet on the second and fourth Wednesday of every month. Second Wednesday is like today. We meet on the noon East Coast, and fourth Wednesday we'll meet on the noon West Coast to make it easier on our friends on the West Coast. Slide and demo code. If you need access, send us an email, and we'll give you the link to get access. And I'm sure Erland will probably share a location where he has the source code, probably his GitHub repo, or probably on his website. I think I know. So we'll share that in the chat also once we get it. We are recording this, so just in case if you ask a question, we cannot see your face, but your question will be the recording, just so you know. And if you want to access this recording and the any previous ones, this is the tiny URL. It's the YouTube channel. You can subscribe to this. These are future sessions. We are booked for the whole year, except Thanksgiving and Christmas break. So most of these are in Meetup. So sign up, and you can read the abstract and decide which one is useful for you. These are some community events. These are whole day training events. We call SQL Saturday or a Data Saturday. They are all over the world. And also there are some other conferences like Data Toboggan. That's mostly for analytics. And most of these are free, so check it out. And Past Summit is out. There is a tiny URL to go and sort this out. This will be in person this year. There's no virtual attendees will be allowed. So you have to come to Seattle if you want to attend this. If you want to speak, you have a suggestion, you have a feedback, something you don't like, something you like, you want us to do more, you want us to do less, send us an email, and we will respond to you. Now, I want to thank Erland for his time and expertise. I never gave this disclaimer before whenever I'm host a session, but I'm going to give it this time. I watched this session live in SQL Bits. So if you are planning to multitask and also watch this session, you rather want to sign off and not waste your time. Because I was reading my notes from SQL Bits, I promised myself to watch the recording at least 2 to 3 times to really consume the material. So if you really want to learn, I would suggest if you can drop everything and just focus on this. Otherwise, it will be hard for you to follow. So with this, I'm going to stop talking and presenting and hand over to Erland. You cannot unmute yourself, so put your questions, comments in the chat. I will monitor and I'll pass it to Erland in due time. Thank you, Erland. You can take over.
Okay. So, you see my screen? Yeah, so welcome to this session entitled Don't Let Your Permissions Be Hijacked. Let's see, and I'm going to have my mouse move over to the other screen where I have the, this is the tricky part where you, so there it is. So, my name is Erland Sommarskog. I live in Stockholm where I work as an independent consultant, and it's a beautiful sunny summer's day here in the evening. I've been at the P for the SQL Server Data platform for many years, and the way to get in touch with me is by old-fashioned email. I don't use any of these fancy social media at sql@sommarskog.se. And you're more than welcome if you have any thoughts, opinions about this session or anything else but SQL to drop me a line. And slides and scripts are available on my website, sommarskog.se/present, and I will see. I did actually type that link into the chat, so now it should be available in the chat as well. And there will be a few more links Oh, yes. So I have a website, Sommarskog.se. I forgot to mention that, which you can see is a small collection of large articles that goes in depth in a couple of topics. And one of the shorter articles actually on that website, at least shorter to be my site, at least, is called Don't Let Your Permissions Be Hijacked. But I also made this into a session because this is something I wanted to create an awareness about, this security risk that you might encounter. So yes, that's it. Permission hijacking. But what is that really? Well, if you've never heard about the term before, well, I made it up myself, so that might be the explanation. But no, what it's all about is that a person with some kind of elevated permissions, but with less permissions than you have, makes you unknowingly run code that uses, or rather abuses, your permissions to perform actions that are advantageous to the attacker, and you would never agree to run if you know that you were running this. And now you may ask yourself, how could that happen? Well, we're going to see an example of this in a few seconds, but first, a few more things before we come there. So, I mean, I like to get your mindset straight, because you might say to yourself, wait, this is just too fantastic. No one ever going to, please, when it comes to security, there is nothing, so things like too unlikely. If an attack can be performed, it will be attempted sooner or later in some place. And you don't want that place to be your workplace. Because all it has to do, what are the stakes involved? How desperate is the attacker? And what can the attacker gain? Well, and what the attacker may want to do. Well, for example, perform advantageous update. The classic example is getting into the employees table and double your salary, but it could be something else. Or maybe the attacker wants to steal data to sell on the darknet, or sell to a competitor, or use it when starting up his or her own business. Or it could be that the attacker is in collusion with some Bitcoin mafia and is going to install ransomware and encrypt all your data and all your servers, etc. Or it could be that just someone who wants to cause a mess. Friends know that he's going to hand in his resignation any day, and he's completely with the company. And so he's going to leave a precedent around. And he doesn't really care if he gets discovered, because he thinks that if the company finds out, they're never going to report me to the police, because then they will get into the press and all that. That would be a bad thing. So they would like to keep this quiet. Also, I like to point out that not all sites are equal. In some places, things are very simple. There is the people who are the DBAs who are sysadmin, and there are plain users that can runs the procedures and select and write the tables. But that's all, and there's nothing in between. Well, they are not very susceptible to the attacks that I want to discuss, but as it says, see below. Elsewhere, it might be more sophisticated, so there is not only sysadmin, but there might be someone in a database who's, only DB owner in that database. It could be an application admin or a lead developer or something like that, or super user. And there may also be people who are, developers who are in the DBA-VUG admin role, or some similar permissions to create code, like developers. Now, this is where you need to watch out. But please don't overlook application logins, because it's far too common that applications run with some kind of elevated permissions. And it's also far too common that applications have SQL injection holes. So that could be used to do these attacks. So even if I said you might be in this situation, you might have application logins. And also, what about developers whose code gets deployed on the server? I will come back to those towards the end of the session. So let's now look at a permission hijacking attack and the evil DDL trigger. So I'm going to start with creating a database here called app2b. Let's see here now. And I'm going to make SA to own app2b. It's quite common to have SA to own all databases. I don't really think this is actually good practice, but I'm going to do this for this time because it makes the demo slightly more interesting. The next thing, I'm going to create a login here for Debbie owner. And Debbie owner is going to be, the database owner in app2b. So she's the lead developer or whatever, application admin. So she's added to the role of DB owner in that database. Now, I could log in as Debbie owner in a separate window, but to make the demo more smooth, run more smoothly, I'm going to impersonate Debbie owner. So I would say this command, execute as a login, and I will be Debbie owner until I run this command, revert. So, and Debbie, she's going to do some normal work. She's going to create the table, and she's going to add some data to that table. Nothing strange there. And then night falls, and it's my duty as the server DBA to run some database maintenance. So I'm going to run dbcc, I'm going to back up the database, and I'm going to rebuild the index on that single table. I don't going to do update statistics because since I already also rebuilt the index. I do that, nothing strange with that. And before we move on, let's review who are the members of sysadmin. And we can see here, well, there's the usual suspects, there's SA, there is me, and there are these 3 service accounts. Now, let's see what Debbie is up to today. She's going to create an auto trigger, even DDL trigger on database. So she's going to create a DDL trigger for DDL database level events. So that is for any DDL in the database. And then she checks if the current user is a member of sysadmin, she's going to do use master auto server role sysadmin, add member Debbie owner. That's kind of rude, isn't it? Okay, she's doing that. And again, I'd false, and I'm going to run my database maintenance. I'll run the check-DB, I'll run back up the database, and let's then review who are the members of sysadmin. Nothing has changed, it's all the same. But then I run the index rebuild. And Debbie is taking over the server. She's now a member of sysadmin. So this is exactly what she did. She hijacked my permission. When I was running this thing as sysadmin, she used the DDL trigger fired, and she could make herself a member of sysadmin. That's really bad. So let's take her out. And before we move on, let's now also do the update statistics. And we can see it has the same effect. That also fires the DDL trigger. So you can see that 2 of the typical commands you would run in database maintenance fires the DDL trigger. Okay, let's now take her out again and start to think about how can we protect ourselves against this. So first of all, let's think, what is really the problem here? Well, the problem is that we're kind of running these commands with too many permissions. We need to be a sysadmin to get into the database, but once we're there, we only need to be DB owner. So what if we could sort of put our system permissions in like a sack and throw them out the window, or at least put them on the pole in a little sack, hang them out the window, and then drag them back when we are done? What if we could do that? Turns out that is very easy to do in SQL Server. So I can say this, I can say execute as user DBO. So I would impersonate DBO, run my commands, and now you might say to yourself, well, wait a minute. I mean, DBO, that's SA. So how is that going to work out? That's not going to help, you think. Well, let's see. I'm going to do this. So I'm going to impersonate DBO. I'm going to run the index rebuild, the statistics, revert, and check. No, Debbie did not make it to sysadmin. So this worked, but why did it work? Well, to understand this, we need to look at these two DMVs, sysuser token and syslogin token. Sysuser token gives us the security tokens that are active on database level. And that's only one, that's DBO, but it's almighty in the database. On server level, there are quite a few more because I'm logged in with the Windows login, so that means all my Windows group also ends up here. But there are also server roles, those are SQL server roles, there's public and there's sysadmin, so almighty here. And you can see as it says usage, for most of these it says grant or deny. But for these two, it says deny only, so they are only good for deny. Now what happens if I impersonate DBO? Let's run this again. On database level, what happens is that, well, I also get public and DB owner, but that doesn't really matter. But what happens on server level? Now I only have SA, public, and sysadmin. So yes, I am SA, but usage here says deny only. So these security tokens are not good for grant. They're only good for deny, and that's why my sysadmin permissions are not active. Now, the next question to answer is, but why is this designed? Why do we do this? I mean, I am sysadmin, so why will it all of a sudden not be permitted to be a sysadmin when I do this? Well, this is because when it comes to impersonation, there's a very, very important principle, and that is what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. That is, if you do impersonation in one scope, it's only valid in that scope. It cannot be trusted outside that scope. So if you do impersonation inside a database, it's only valid in the database. It's not valid in the rest of the server. Because if it was, then Debbie could do execute as user equals DBO and become sysadmin that way. That would be just far too simple. So that's why they have this restriction. Now, you might say to yourself, well, wait a minute, Debbie could be smart. What if she puts that revert command inside the DDL trigger? Well, let's try that. So she's going to make this modification to see if she can outsmart me. So let's do that. And I'm going to try this again. And no, that did not help. This is because the revert command only acts against an execute as in the same scope. So if there had been an execute as inside the DDL trigger, yeah, the revert would have had effect on that one. But it does not have effect on this one, and that's a very, very good thing for security, because if that hadn't been the case, this protection wouldn't have worked. Before I leave this demo, I want to get rid of this DDL trigger because it's evil. So, to summarize what we have seen, when running index and statistics maintenance, an application admin or someone else with permissions to create DDL trigger could install the DDL trigger that performs some kind of malicious actions, abusing the permissions of sysadmin. And I'd like to point out that adding a user to sysadmin, that is just one example. And maybe not the best thing to do, because let's say now that there is an IT audit and they ask, okay, who are the members of sysadmin? And what? Debbie Ola, what's she's doing there? And Debbie could now be in a bit of trouble. But she could do something else. She could steal data, manipulate data, well, something evil. Maybe add a login temporarily and then remove it. Yeah, you know. Anyway, the line of defense is based on something called POP, the principle of least privilege. And in difference to permission hijacking, this is not a term that I made up, but it's an established term. There is a Wikipedia link. Let's see if I can. I don't think I can copy that link in, put it into the chat. Anyway, there is an article about that in Wikipedia. There is also a good blog post from Andreas Walter. Andreas Walter is a program manager on the security team for SQL Server and a former MVP. So that's quite good reading about that. And in this particular case, we applied POP by saying execute as user equals DBO. And that way we got rid of all our sysadmin permissions, but we had still full powers inside the database to do the database maintenance. Now, although now you have learned the defense, there is a hiccup you need to be aware of that could lead you into trouble. So I'm going to restore a database that comes from another server. And then I'm going to move to that database and try to impersonate DBO. And when I do this, I get message 15,517 cannot execute as a database principal because the principal DBO does not exist, or this type of principal cannot be impersonated, or you do. Oh, wait, what's that? Or you do not have permission. Do not have permission. I'm sysadmin. Of course I have permission to do that. Now, the reason this happens is found here, because it has to do with the fact that the owner of a database is recorded in two places. So it's recorded in the owner SID column, this is databases, but you also have the SID column in this database principles for the DBO user. And when I run this, it turns out that they are not the same. And this is because when you restore a database, if the database already exists on the server, well, the owner recorded in these databases will be retained. If it does not exist on the server with that name, well, the owner will be the user running the restore command. But it will never be the user that is DBO inside the database, which for all matters could be a user that is not a login on this particular instance. And nor will restore go and change the SID inside the database. So very good practice when you have restored a database is to change the owner. And I should put in this is not the only reason you can get into trouble. Often when I see this on forums, it's when people try to install database diagrams, or you're doing things with Service Broker, but there also is impersonation involved. That's the underlying problem. So, and anyway, what I'd like to show you now what I think is best practice for database ownership. I think a database should be owned by an SQL login that exists solely to own that database and has no other permissions whatsoever, and which is disabled. So I'm going to create it. I'm going to give it a random password. I don't even want to see it, so I'm going to do dynamic SQL, and I'm going to disable it, and I'm going to make it the owner. As for why I think this is best practice, it's a little outside the scope for this session. And anyway, so you will just have to trust me when I say so. And anyway, now when I impersonate DBO, that works out fine. But this was something you need to be aware of, that you can run into trouble. So this slide basically only repeats what I said in the demo. So I will move on and talk about running database maintenance in general. Now in the demo, I ran my own commands, but normally you would run it manually. And hopefully you're not writing your own maintenance jobs, but you're running some of the standard solutions that are out there. And I think and hope quite a few are using Ola Hallangen's maintenance solution, which is the #1 solution for database maintenance. And if you are in a very good position, because index optimize accepts the parameter at execute as user, which you can set to DBO or any other user of your choice. So here has it all set up and done for you with this protection. Now, some people insist on running the maintenance plans in Management Studio. Bad news, there is no provision to doing execute as user if you use Management Studio. So what can you do in that case? Well, first of all, one option is to only do backup in DBCC, which does not fire the DDL trigger. And then you tell the users, okay, but you don't have to run index and statistics maintenance yourself. And actually, I think that is what they're doing in Azure for other reasons, because that could, if they don't want to run index maintenance right in the middle of basic operations. And of course, Microsoft doesn't know when you're running basic operations. But if you feel that, oh, no, it's my duty, I need to do this, well, you can have, rather than having one task for all databases, you can have one task for every database. And then you have to set up a login for each task. And that will be a login that is DB owner solely in that database. And if you set up the database ownership in the way that I showed you in the previous demo, well, that could be the login you could use for that task. Now, let's talk about DDL in general, because you realize that database maintenance is only just one way you can do these attacks. But of course, any DDL you do as a server DBA is dangerous, like creating indexes, creating users, granting permissions, etc. Anything you do in a database where there is someone who is a DBA owner or similar, who can create DDL triggers, but who is not sysadmin him or herself. So you must bracket all DDL you do in that database with execute as user equals DBL. And this corollary of this is you cannot use the UI in Management Studio directly. You must use SQL commands. But wait, some might know, and I'll get a little bit nervous because you want to use the UI. Okay. You can still use the UI, but you must absolutely stay away from that OK button down here. But you can do your thing in the UI and then use the script button on top. That will script out the commands into a window, and then you can add execute as user, etc. on top of that. There is nothing built into Management Studio to do this, so you will have to do that your part yourself. Now, so far we have talked attacks against sysadmin, but sysadmin is not the only one that can run into trouble. So Debbie is going to get an assistant in the database called DevDave. He's going to help with, well, the application side of things. So he's going to write the procedures, he's going to create tables and that kind of thing. So we're going to add him to the role DBA-admin, and we're going to give him rights to run any stored procedures in the database, because if he can create stored procedures, of course he should also be able to run them, or else he can't test them. And because he can write stored procedures all over the database, and therefore by ownership chaining also write data to tables that are owned by DBO, we might as well give him full permissions on all tables in the database, because he will have these permissions anyway. So we're going to do that. And DevDave, well, let's see what it's doing. It's starting with writing the procedure on that single table. Seems nothing wrong with that. And before we move on, let's review who are the member of DB owner. Well, yeah, that's DBO. There is DB owner, and also DB owner itself comes up here. Now let's see now what DevDave is up to now. He's going to create a DDL trigger. Can he do that as DBDDL? I mean, okay, well, for all DDL database level events, any DDL, and okay, if the current user is member of sysadmin, oh, the same trigger as Debbie. Kind of people is hanging around on this server. But Dave thinks that, okay, I might not be able to make it a sysadmin because I know the DBA is smart. But what about DB owner? At least I could maybe get this cool as Debbie come into the DB owner role. So he's going to try that. And yes, he could create that DDL trigger. He could do that. That he had permissions to do that. And now Debbie's going to create a second table. So she does that. And let's now look. Yes, DevDave was able to hijack the permissions and get himself into DB owner. Now, how could Debbie protect herself against this? Well, this is a little bit of a special situation, but we have to think a little bit. As I mentioned, or already so kind of brought up, should Dave really have permissions to deal with DDL triggers? I don't think so, because he is going to work with the application, and the DDL triggers, that's not part of the application, or at least I can't see it. It seems very far-fetched to me that the DDL trigger would be part of the application. It's something you would use for auditing, for example. Like Debbie might want to have a DDL trigger to track what DevDave is doing. Now, so Dave has no business there. So Debbie's going to do this. First of all, she's going to review what DDL triggers do we have. Oh, DevDave's DDL trigger. No, we don't want that one. So let's drop that one. And then we're going to take dev Dave out of DB owner. Yes, he's out, good. Then we're also going to take him out of DDL admin. We're going to create a new role called our DDL admin. And we're going to make our DDL admin a member of DB DDL admin. And then we're going to say this very important command: deny alter any database DDL trigger to our DDL admin. So we're not permitting our DDL admin to run DDL triggers. And then we're making dev Dave a member of our DDL admin. And then before dev Dave's Debbie closes her work, she makes sure that once more that yes, dev Dave is not member of DB owner. And now dev Dave is going to create a table, it's going to create a procedure. And he can do that, no problem. But then he finds out, wait a minute, what about the DDL trigger? It's gone. I want it back, he says. But no. Cannot create the trigger Dave's DDL trigger because you do not have permission. So that's the important thing. And this slide repeats what I said. Developers do not have permissions to create DDL triggers. One thing I did not say is that rather than having a SQL Server role, you can also have an AD group. Now you may ask, why not just simply deny DDL admin directly? Why have this extra group role? And the answer is that you cannot do that. SQL Server does not permit us to run deny for a built-in role. Now, before we move on, here's the kind of interlude of there's commands that we have used a little bit, and we're going to come back more in this session. So I'd like to discuss a few things I'd like to point out. So when you do execute as user, you're impersonating a database user. And when you do this, you are sandboxed into the current database. You cannot access other databases or server level objects. However, you can access TempDB and master because they have the guest use enabled. So you can access temp tables. And to do this, you need impersonate permission on the user. And of course, if you are a member of DB owner, you have that permission. Execute as login. This means that you're impersonating a server login. When you do this, there is no sandboxing inside SQL Server. You can reach any database. You can access any server object when you do this. And to do this, you need impersonate on the login. That's a server level permission. And of course, if you're a member of sysadmin, you have that permission. Both of these are great for testing permissions. So let's say that you're setting up a database role and you want that role to be able to do this, this, and this, but not to do that, that, and that. Well, then you can create a user without login, add into that role, impersonate it, play around, and see, and to verify that it works as you want it. And same thing also when setting up a login to test on server level. And execute as user is really good for removing all our server level permissions, as we have seen. The revert command, as I showed you, the revert command. So when you do impersonation, it's enforced until you run the command revert in the same scope. So if you do revert in one step procedure, call another step procedure that does revert. Sorry, if you do execute as in one step procedure, and then you call another step procedure that does revert, it has no effect. Excuse me a little bit.
Erland, so there's a question.
Sorry, excuse me, Paul.
To what level are these failed security attempts logged?
Let's see. What level are these failed security attempts logged? Not sure that I understand the question. I wouldn't say that they are being logged at all unless you have some auditing set up. For example, and also let's say also what is the fail in this case? If you try to do permission hijacking in the DDL trigger and it was not run by sysadmin, it's not going to be logged anywhere because the code didn't fire. So, but I'm not. Maybe you could clarify the question a little bit.
It was for the forensics purpose, Erland?
Sorry?
For forensics.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So this fail. I mean, if the hijacking fails because the permissions were not present, there was nothing to log really, unless of course you have some auditing involved. Excuse me. I have had a problem with a sore throat this week, so I'm still kind of recovered. But so I think I'm going to move on. Anyway, so the revert command has to be executed from the same database as where you started, where you did execute that. So if you do impersonate to log in a database A and then you move to database B and do revert, you will get an error. You must go back to B before you can do revert. Also, here's a tip. Always, like you might have noticed in my script, revert was in a batch of its own. There is no syntactic requirement for this, but if you put it in the same batch, you do execute as some commands and do revert, and that batch fails, well, the revert may not be executed, but then you might think it has been executed when you go back, and you will be very confused. I know this because it has happened to me more than once. So yeah, learn that the hard way. And also good to know is that if you run one revert or one or two more reverts too many, that's not really in error because extraneous revert are just simply completely ignored. And there are also variations. So you can actually say execute as with a no revert, and there might be situations where you need this. I will come back to that towards the end. So linked servers is something we can run into problems when we're doing this impersonation game. So I like to discuss them a little bit. First of all, when you execute as user, you cannot access linked servers at all because they are server objects. You're completely locked out from them. Well, when we set up a linked server, we have two choices for the authentication, as you might know. One is self-mapping, which means that the users log on to the remote data source with their own credentials. And this is quite great for security, but it does not always work out for one reason or another. And then we can set up login mapping, which means that they log in with the username and password pre-stored in SQL Server, which means that all users use that one. And we can set up this per user or for everyone, so that we can either say that, okay, all users login mapping except for that user or vice versa. Now, the important thing here is that if you do execute as login, self-mapping is not going to work out because what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. That is, your impersonation of a login is valid inside the SQL Server instance, but it's not valid in Windows. It's not valid on the other instance. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Now let's move on and talk about DML triggers and stored procedures. So far, the attacks has been through DDL triggers, but of course we can do these attacks in regular triggers or in stored procedures. So let's say that you're doing some data maintenance, like adding new data or just going to correct data, manually insert statements, etc. Others, well, Debbie could do that, or you could do that as a sysadmin. And all of a sudden, there is a trigger on that table that goes in, oh, wait a minute, these permissions are available. Let's do this. Yeah, and of course, you're not going to, if you're going to work with these tables every day, you're not going to check all of a sudden, oh, there's a trigger today, what? And maybe you may even expect that to be a trigger that's doing normal work. Or you're running some procedures, maybe you're running the application directly, or maybe you are doing some using maintenance procedures in order to do something. And of course, on the fourth nesting level down there, a developer may have hidden some malicious code all of a sudden. And of course, you're doing this every day. You can't go and check the code every day. That's impractical. Now, so how do you protect yourself? Well, if it's only a matter of protecting the system, because there is no one between a DBO and the plain users in the database, it's the same thing as before. Impersonate DBO and you will be fine. Now, it might be that your database maintenance requires you to work with data from other sources like a linked server or another database. What you could do in that case is to read that data into temp tables before you do the impersonation, and because you can, and then you work with these temp tables because you can even if you have done execute as use equals DBO, you can still access temp tables. Now, how to protect DBO in this situation? So Debbie is going to protect herself against DevDave. So of course he can play that trick as well. We have to go back to POP, principle of least privilege. So if Debbie is going to do data maintenance, she does not need her full powers to create uses or create set of audit specifications, etc., etc. She only needs insert permissions. Same thing if she's going to run the procedures. So the way she would do is to create a sandbox user with limited permissions and impersonate that user. So for example, she could do this, create a sandbox user without login. So this is a command that not everyone may be aware of, but you can do this. You can create a user that is a kind of orphaned user by design. And this is great for, and I mentioned this previously, if you want to test just a user for test database permissions, but it's also great in this case because Debbie does not have the permissions to create logins. And then she would give the sandbox user some reasonable set of permissions, in this case, running all the procedures and full permissions to all tables, and just impersonate that user. And of course, if she's only going to work with two tables, she does not full permissions in all tables, but we also have to be a little bit practical. So we might to set up some reasonable set of permissions, and particularly if it's only a matter of protecting yourself against someone like DevDave, who already have these permissions. So that the sandbox user would be okay. But let's say that in the database, there's also Betty Business Analyst. And Betty, well, she has full read permissions of all tables, but she doesn't have write permissions. But she has her own schema where she can create tables. And then she says, oh, you know, Debbie, I've messed up my tables a little bit. Can you help me? And Betty pretends that she's not very good at SQL. But here, Debbie needs to watch out. Because let's say that she's going to work with those tables, and all of a sudden, Betty has done something in her triggers that goes and modifies data and hijacking the permissions of the sandbox user. So in that case, Debbie maybe have to have a sandbox user that only has permissions to Betty's schema to make sure that there's no permission hijacking going on. So here is a scenario. Let's say this, you're a sysadmin, and you're being asked to do some clean up task in the database. They ask you because, hey, you're good at SQL, but you're normally not working in that database, but the people there, they handle themselves. You only do the server level stuff. So, but then you ask, okay, but do you have a sandbox user I can use? And you only get blank stare back because they have no idea what you're talking about. But you still want to play safe because you don't want to get the blame if something happens. So this is how you would do it. First of all, if you need any data from outside sources, you get those into temp tables. You impersonate DBA with the executors user. Then you create the sandbox user without login and grant permissions. You impersonate the sandbox user. You do your task, revert back to DBA. You drop the sandbox user because you don't want to leave things around since you're only doing a guest appearance, and you revert back to your true self. So yes, we can see here you're doing impersonation in 2 steps. And yes, you can do this. You can do impersonation in many steps, as many steps as you like, as long as the one thing you impersonate still has permission to do impersonation. And you need to do this because if you create the sandbox user without doing impersonating DBA, well, that could be a DDL trigger that hijacks you. And you need to impersonate the sandbox users to avoid that DB owner gets hijacked. Now, things may be a little more difficult because maybe we need to access outside the database. And we do execute as user. We are sandboxed into the current database. But let's say that our store procedures are making cross-database access, or let's say that I talk about we can get data into temp tables, but maybe these external tables are very big and we don't know exactly which rows we need on beforehand. So yeah, well, we like to be able to join them when we do our updates. So how to deal with this? Well, in that case, we need a login rather a sandbox user, and then we can personate that login with executors a login. Or since it's a login, we can also log in as it in a separate window if we prefer. That's very easy to do for sysadmin, but if for a person like Debbie, well, she would need to ask the server DBA to create one and then get impersonate rights on that login or get the password, whichever she like. And if we're going to play that sandbox login, so this is a little more complicated, but just do it quickly, the same scenario as before. So we're going to create the sandbox login, and all databases we need to access, we impersonate DBA, create the database user for the sandbox login, and grant permissions and revert. Then impersonate the sandbox login as executors login, or log in as it in a separate window. Perform our task, revert back to our true selves, and in all databases again, impersonate DBA, we drop the database user and revert, and then we can drop the login. Now you may ask, well, wait, this was a bit complicated. Can I keep these things around? And yes, that login, if you're going to use that sandbox login often, yeah, you can have it around. But be a little more, and yeah, I can also disable it if you're only going to do it for execute as login, of course. And I should mention this, by the way, you can do this even if the instance is not enabled for SQL authentication. You can still create these SQL logins and do this, because that only permits when you're doing a login. So you can still impersonate an SQL login, even if the server is not available for SQL authentication. Now, but watch out, if there are many databases on the server, you should always create the database user when you need it and drop them when you're done. Because else, so let's say you're going to do some work in databases A and B, but all of a sudden, yes, there is a trigger in that on those tables, and oh, wait a minute, the current user has permissions to database C. Let's go there. Because if you have a sandbox user, a user for the sandbox in every database. So that's why you should do this. The principle of least privilege. If you're only going to work with databases A and B, you should not have permission to C. Now, what if the operation involves a linked server? Now it starts to get a little more complicated, but it's unfortunately not very uncommon. So, and if login mapping is set up with login mapping, if the linked server is set up with login mapping, impersonating a sandbox login is still going to work out. But what if it's set up with self-mapping? It starts to get complicated. Well, you can set up login mapping for the sandbox login only. But keep in mind, though, that if you're going to do this, the remote server must be enabled for SQL authentication, because When you do login mapping, I forgot to mention this, but when you do login mapping, it must always be an SQL login for an SQL Server instance. It cannot be a Windows user. So, and if that server is not enabled for SQL authentication, you probably don't want to restart it. The other alternative is to make the Sandbox user to be a Windows user. You have to talk with the AD admin, and then you can start a management studio with Runner, so you don't have to make a complete new login into Windows. Now let's move over and talk about application users. And an application may log in users with integrated security, or very, very common application uses its own login password. Particularly web applications like to do this, but there are also other applications that think that, no, we're going to use a special application login. No matter what, ideally, these users or application login should only have permissions to run the procedures, and these procedures then is going to do all the permission checks. But we all know that far from all applications do this, so you might have no choice but to granting select, and maybe even insert, update, and delete permissions. But this is where it stops. You should never grant more permissions, agree to grant more permissions. And the reason for this is SQL injection. And basically, if there is an application, we can assume there is an SQL injection hole. Because, yes, and even if there isn't one today, just a junior developer comes in and there is one tomorrow. I mean, we have been doing this for more than 20 years, but it still happens. It's just so sad. Anyway, so even if you grant these permissions, that can be bad enough because that permits the attacker to do, well, delete important data or make updates where the user has no business, but at least the damage is confined to the database itself. It doesn't spread to the rest of the instance, the rest of the server file. And by the way, if you have an application login, they can serve very well as Sandbox users, by the way. Now, but you might say, well, wait a minute, this application needs to perform permissions beyond execute or read write on tables. So let's take, well, maybe not the best example, maybe the most common example, but a simple one. So let's say we want to show a count of how many users that are connected to the database. To count the number of users, we need to access the DMV, sys DMX sessions. But to do this and see all sessions, not only our own, we need the permission of use server state. And we don't want to grant that to the login, but what if we could package that into the procedure, like granting the procedure the permission and a full control over how to use that permission? What if we could do that? And yes, we can. We can sign the procedure with a certificate, and from this certificate, we create a user or a database user or a server login, depending on what kind of permission we want to package, and then we grant that user login the required permissions. Now, that was quite a bit of a mouthful. That's not it. May not register right away, and unfortunately, there's no time at all to show this actually in practice. However, on my website, there is an article called Packaging Permissions in Stored Procedures, where I describe this technique in quite a lot of bit of detail. And it's quite a long article. It's longer than the article that this one is based on. But one reason it is long is because I also try to explain how the technique works. And I think this, using an advanced security feature without understanding how it works is not secure, because then you might use it in the wrong way. In the article also, there is also a procedure and a script to automate the process. And if you like watching presentation, there's also recording on YouTube. And again, I can't really put that link, figure out how I'm going to put that link in the chat. But if you download the deck, you will have the link. And the link is also available on my website. If you go to my website, there is a video section.
Erland, there is two questions came in.
Okay.
In order to run performance monitoring, sysadmin is needed, except in SQL Server 2022. Is there a better way to protect sysadmin just for monitoring? And the same person asked another question, how about comparison between SQL login and Windows all?
Let's see here. In order to run performance monitoring, sysadmin is needed, except in... Oh, well, when you're running monitoring, yeah, many tools says, oh, you need to be sysadmin to do this. Often it should be sufficient with view server state or view server performance state and new permission involved in SQL 2022. However, the vendor for the tool might say, oh, yep, you need to be sysadmin to do this, and if you're not sysadmin, we're not going to run. Oh, that's just far too common. Depends on what the monitoring tool is doing. If it's only monitoring, it should not be firing any triggers in the database. And it particularly should not write to user databases. That would be really crazy. I would say a monitoring tool that writes the user database, I will be very, very suspect of that tool and just say, no, please not. But I can't speak for all tools that are out there. Then there was some question about SQL against a Windows auth. Not sure that I see. There's not really a difference between these two in this particular context here, I think. I would need a clarification if you have anything special in mind. I mean, I could talk a lot about the difference between those two, but I think that it's out of scope for this session. So that was no more questions, but that was maybe. Yeah, okay, that was about the recording. I'll leave that to you. So I will move on. And we could also, if you think that you want to know more, we can take those questions afterwards, since some people might want to get back to work. But anyway, so I don't have the time to show you this technique here, but I still like to discuss it. And I would like to give you some key facts about this technique. So I said you can do this, you sign the procedure, but the thing is, you can package the permission this way. But here's the cool stuff. When you change the procedure, the permissions and the signature will go away. So it has to be signed again. Now, why is this important? Well, let's say this. Debbie, she wants this procedure that shows the use count. And she comes up to you and you look at this. Yep, I think this is good. You sign it. But then Debbie thinks, no, I want this procedure to do this as well and to abuse that permission. But then she finds out, wait a minute, it doesn't work anymore. So she comes back to you and then you look, wait a minute. No, Debbie. No way. I'm not going to, please go back to the original version. That is not good. So you are, as a server level DBA, in full control of how the permission is used. And particularly in the realm of permission hijacking, here is something which is really, really interesting. So let's say that this procedure is doing some dynamic SQL. Well, the package permission will apply there, which means that if you only want to grant execute permissions to the application login, but you still want to do dynamic SQL and use the procedures, well, then you can package the select permission with the procedure. Also, if you're calling a system procedure, well, the permissions packaged with the procedure will also be available inside the system procedure. But if you are calling a sub-procedure, you're firing a trigger or a function user-written code, no, the permissions are no longer there. They are no longer available, which means that the package permissions cannot be hijacked. When you sign the procedure, what you see is what you sign. You don't have to worry about, well, what if they sneak in a trigger there? They can't be abused. Or watch out if they're using dynamic SQL, because maybe that dynamic SQL, or rather very likely includes something you don't have control over. It could be an input parameter. They could be reading data from a table, or they could use a table name and then do dirty things with that. So watch out, then you have to be very careful. Now let's move over and talk about agent jobs. So Dave comes up to you and says, Mr. DBA, we have a purge job in our system. We need to, could you schedule an agent job to run this like 2 o'clock in the morning? Can you do this, please? And what Dave is now hoping for is that you will be on autopilot and just do this, and it will run a sysadmin, and you can see Debbie Dana in high five, and because now they can do all sorts of changes and run that procedure as sysadmin. That would be great. But of course, you are smarter than that, so you want to lead over and say, you know, Dave, I have a better idea. I think you should schedule that procedure to run from the task schedule on the application server. Because I mean, between you and me, agent is for management tasks. It's not really for application jobs. I mean, is it? I mean, anyone disagrees? Although, yes, we may not win that battle, but we can at least try. Before we're going to look at alternatives, just some general principles about agents I'd like to establish. First of all, I think no one disagrees. Job owners should not be persons who can leave the company, because that can cause problems. Also, at least I don't like adding users to MSDB because it's a creepy place. Like you think, oh, I got to give that user just that little small permission. All of a sudden, they got the full hand in, or even more. And from this follows that setting up an agent job is always a sysadmin task. What the job is doing, the code for the job, that's a developer task. But setting up the job itself, that will be sysadmin. Also, I think the application jobs that runs an agent, well, they should execute with the same permissions as application users. And if they need to do extra things about that, well, use permission signings. Let's say, for example, the application has a petition table, and every month you have to create a new permission. Well, that will be a signed procedure to do that task, because that's part of the application, in my opinion. Now, so what alternatives do we have for the purge job? Well, so this is one option. On the job step, on the advanced page, we can say run as user. And, for example, app login. And what is going to happen in that case is the agent is going to impersonate that user with execute as user. And then that means that will be sandboxed into the database, so there will be no cross-database access or linked service available. But if it's only a purge job, it's going to work out fine. If they're actually doing archiving into another database or another server, it's not going to work out. Good also to know, if you do this, the job must be owned by a sysadmin. If not, the setting is just flatly ignored. The next alternative is to set the job owner. So we do that on the first page of the job, like app login here. And that could be an SQL login or a Windows login with application permission. So it has to make sure that it has those permissions we talked about before. In this case, agent is going to impersonate the owner with execute as a login. So there's no restriction with cross-database or server access. So if that purge job is going to archive to another database, that's going to not be a problem. If they're going to archive to a linked server, though, well, it can still be complicated because a linked server with login mapping is going to work out, but those with self-mapping will not, because we're doing execute as a login. And I don't really like this option because it has a nasty side effect. The job owner will actually be added as a user to MSDB and a member of the SQL agent user role. Not directly, no, it happens next time you install a cumulative update or a GDR, that is a security fix. Yes, it's true, I did not test it with the most recent CU, but it did happen with SQL 2022 CU1, and that has been there for such a long time. And please don't ask why. Now, the last alternative is to use a command exit job with a proxy. This is a little more complicated, but it also, because there is no impersonation, it's also the most general method. Agent will perform a relogin into Windows. So I like this. This is kind of my favorite. Now, so the first step is to get an AD account. And then you create a login for that AD account to SQL Server. And if there are linked servers involved, well, then you have to create it on more than one instance. And then you create database user and grant application permissions. So, for example, if you have an application users role in the database, you will add that login to the application users role. And then you create a credential for this account in SQL Server. So you say create credential with identity, and that is the name of the Windows user, including the domain. And the secret, well, that is the password in Windows for this. And the name of the credential, well, you can have Gretchen here and Catherine here, whatever, but of course it makes sense to have the same name, except for the domain part. The next step, then you're going to create the job. So when you open you're going to create a job with access, let's take a look at it. You have to create a proxy in agent. When you open the agent node, and there are a couple of jobs, and then there are proxies a little bit further down, and then you have to create a subsystem. So you're going to create, say, operator system command exec, and then you use the credential in the previous step, and you have to give the proxy a name. And of course, again, you could have Gretchen here and Catherine here, but yes, I would recommend that you have the same name for the proxy and the credential. And then you create the job in agent with sysadmin as the owner. And then you create the job step. So first of all, you say that the type is command exec, not a transact SQL job step. And then you fill in the proxy in the run as. The run as box is empty when you have a TSQL job step because you cannot do this thing here. But here you can do this, and you can select either run as agent or the proxy. And what's going to happen now when you specify this proxy is that agent's going to look up, okay, this proxy maps to this credential, and then ask SQL Server, please give me the identity and the secret. And then agent is going to log into Windows as that user with that password, and then run the command you specified here. And typically there will be an execution of SQL command. And then you will have these options. First of all, -i, that is for turning on quote identifier, because by default SQL command runs with the code identifier off. Really stupid, but that is the case. -b is very important because this tells SQL command if there is an error in the code, please return the error code to the command line. If you don't have this, agent will not notice if the job failed. So this is very important. -s is followed by some piece of mumbo jumbo. That is an agent token. And the point with this is that if you move the job to another server, well, you don't have to think about changing the server name. It will be the same. And then finally, we have -d for the database and -q for the command to run. And in very most cases, that will be running as to procedure. Now, as I said, we would like to keep people out of MSDB so that the developers and the application admin, well, they don't have access to MSDB, so they can't see agent history. So you need to set up a mail notification so they get a mail if the job fails. And if they also want it unsuccessful, of course, you can do that. And then on the advanced page of the job step, you can define output file. Although this does not work when you set a job owner, that is not sysadmin. That's another nail in the coffin for that option. And then you direct the output to a share where the application team has access. So once the job has been set up, the application team can see, or they get an notification, it runs. Okay, this time it ran, but it took 5 hours. That's bad. But they also have the log file so they can see what happened, but they don't have to involve you. Now, so far we have talked about attacks performed by people who has been authenticated to the server as a user, or at least are coming in through an SQL injection hole. But these attacks can be performed even without access to the server. I mean, you get a deployment package from the application team, and it's a long script with, well, whatever it is, lots of things in it. And it could involve all sorts of naughty stuff, like they sneak in extra logins of users with elevated permissions. They could manipulate data in any database on the server. Or what about this? They know that you are also the sysadmin on that very, very secret server over there. So they set up a temporary linked server and with self-mapping and then whoops, get a lot of data. And then, because they can't access this server they wanted in a place where they can get it, they set up another linked server to another test, like a test server where they have access and whoops, park that data. And of course, since that script is running for a long time, you may not even notice. Excuse me. Oh, I'm running. I will run over because I have to excuse them for a few questions. I've got 3 minutes left and there are a couple of more slides. I hope you can live with that. How do you defend yourself against this? So, for a plain script, well, we have seen this before, execute as user DBA, but we need this with no revert, because now we are writing a script. That could be a revert command in the script, but with no revert, that revert is going to result in an error. And if that happens, it's time to call the police. That's absolutely something fishy going on. Although if you do this, execute as user DBA, what you're doing in practice, you're saying that, yeah, that team are DBA owner. So you may want to, if they only want to work with code, they're not going to create users in that, well, then you might have a sandbox user that is an RDDL admin. Because I'm thinking here that the script is just doing so many things in the database that there's no practical way you can review all that code. But what you want to make sure is that they're not doing things outside the database. And, oh yes, I should mention this, all depending on what permissions you have. Let's say that this is a vendor database. But where you are permitted, or the customer is permitted to have their own tables in a separate schema, in a dedicated schema, well, then the sandbox user will only have permission to that schema. So you have to choose wisely what permissions the sandbox user has. And if their actions are expected outside the database, like they might do things that make sense on the database, well, then of course you can use the sandbox login. And then you might also make sure that this sandbox login has the permissions. Oh yeah, they might want to do this on server, and I can accept that and grant that server login, for example. I like to recommend that you do this. You first make a run in QA, because that might reveal, because they say, oh, we're only doing things inside the database, but then explodes both here and there, because, oh yeah, we forgot that. However, this may not necessarily reveal the malicious access, because they may check the permissions available, or they may check the server name. No, let's only do this in production. Let's not do this in QA. Now, things can be a little more difficult here, though. Let's say that the deployment script may actually doing legit actions with very high permissions. Let's say this is a server that is dedicated to one single application. So they're going to do sp configure. You might agree with that. Of course, you can say, oh, please give me these high privileged things in a separate script so I can review those. However, it may be that you get the deployment through DAC pack or MSI install, or it's a vendor package, so you can't really ask them to split up the whole thing. So what you're going to do now? Well, I guess auditing is the only choice. You set up an audit what's going on server level so you can see if something sneaky happened there. And on the database, you only have to give up. Now, auditing, that's a completely different story that I don't want to talk about, go into detail. But the one thing I like to point out is that there's more than one option to do audit, but SQL Server audit might be the only option that audits that has been turned off. Because of course, if they are doing malicious stuff, they want to try to turn off auditing. But if you can see that in the audit log, oh, it was stopped. That's interesting. And particularly DDL triggers, some people may like that. Remember, DDL triggers can be turned off with disabled trigger, which does not fire DDL triggers. Now, there's one more attack I'd like to discuss, and that is attacks through applications. So you're using the time reporting system or some other local application, and like a purchase order or whatever, and the developer of that application has a hook. And, oh, wait a minute, Mr. DBA is running that. Oh, let's go into the HR system and double my salary. And how are you going to protect yourself against that? I mean, because you run that application, you can't do execute as user because you're only using a UI. Well, what you can do very much, but what the IT department can do is this. They make sure that you have more than one login. So I was working, I did some job with a bank, which was not my direct client, but a client to my customer. And I had 2 logins there. So one, I logged into Windows, normal, and I guess for reading mail and all that. And then to do the DBA stuff, I had a second login, which I used to log into a jump server, and then I could access the sensitive servers. So that's a great thing. So the normal logins should not have access to the databases. And also, of course, you can have some, maybe the IT should set up some network control. Maybe the application server for system A should not be able to access the database system for the database for server for database X. Probably a good thing. So, still over time, but I got a summary and a few final words I'd like to make. So, what this has been about is this: malicious users with some elevated permissions can inject code that you unknowingly execute with your permissions, performing actions that you don't agree to. And remember, elevated permissions here include access to the deployment pipeline. Oh yeah, continuing integration, someone checks into Git and it's 30 minutes later it's in production. Yep. Maybe flexible, convenient, but yeah, there could be security issues there. Yep. Now, the summary of what it means of protections we've talked about is based on principle of least privilege, POP. And impersonate DBO to get rid of your server level permissions, to protect the owner from being hijacked, use sandbox users or logins, never put people directly into DDL admin, but create a role out of DDL admin to deny the rights to do DDL triggers. Because I think DDL triggers should only be for DB owner, no one else. And application users should have limited permissions, at most select, insert, update, and delete on tables. Application tasks and agent jobs should run with application permissions, never elevate permissions. Use procedure signing with application users need to perform actions beyond their permission set. And again, yes, the application team may in practice be equal to the DB owner, even if they don't have access to the server. And also, before I close this, some final words. Yes, some of the attacks I've suggested may seem very contrived. That's true. But remember, if the stakes are high enough, a possible attack will be attempted sooner or later in some place. Because if it can be done, they're going to do it. Now, I mentioned in the beginning some reason why people would do these attacks, but there's one attacker I left out, but I still like to mention. The benevolent attacker. The benevolent attacker. Yes, that is not someone who's doing these attacks about malicious things, but it's one of your co-workers such as simply is want to work around red tape. So I mentioned previously the application team adding extra logins. And it could be that the application team are completely sick and tired of every time when there's an issue in the application, they have to ask you to run a query, get query plans, etc. So they say, let's be done with it. We want to serve our users faster. So they're going to sneak in the extra login. Let us just discuss this. But of course, that's the wrong way to do it. If they need access to the server, they should talk with their boss and talk with their boss and down to your boss, etc., etc. That would be the right way to do it. So anyway, of course, you could have made those users say something, but you decided to lock down permissions. And it's certainly not a bad idea in itself. But once you start to do this, okay, this user only needs to be DB owner, yeah. But if you don't watch out, if you don't follow up, they may find a way to, well, work around those restrictions. And that is what this session has been about. So that's all that I had to say. My name is Erland Sommarskog. My email address is here again if you want to reach me. And slides and scripts are available at my website. That should also be in the chat. And on my website, you find here's the direct link to the article itself. And also, if you do the demos, here's a link to cleanup script. And I'm sorry for running over a few minutes, but I blame that partly on my coughing, partly on the fact that there were a few questions. And if we have any more questions, I'm willing to stay here as long as there are people who want to ask.
There's just a last question from Manish. How about DB chaining? Is this preferred way to have cross DB access?
Cross database chaining is a feature I recommend against because it actually permits someone in the database who has permissions, well, let's say DB owner, can actually use a DB chaining if the database enabled for DB chaining can elevate the sysadmin. This is because MSDB is also enabled for sysadmin, then you can do some dirty tricks. There is actually in my permissions article, not this one, but the other one, granting packaging permissions. I discussed this briefly, how you could do this attack. I haven't actually tried it myself, but yes, you can do this because you can write us the procedure that goes and do things in MSDB, And then, yes, of course, you can add a job which runs a system. So DB chaining is not a feature that I recommend.
Okay, thank you. And then other people just commented, very informative and fascinating stuff. Yeah, Manish says good with your answer. I do not see anything else. So I am going to stop recording, and thank you everyone for joining. And we'll see
thank you
you.
for listening.
Thank you, Erland. This was really
Thanks,
fabulous.
especially Telps for inviting me.
And Theo, thank you for warning us for not multitasking. That was really useful, I tell you.
I agree,
Well,
Theo.
I mean, I'm probably not as smart as many of you, but when I watched it even live, sitting in the room without any computer or any device, I still had a hard time to consume it. So, and now we are all sitting at a computer, and I truly believe it. I just didn't make it to make Erland happy. I mean, Erland is always happy, and always, trying to help us out. So anyway, so I'm going to stop recording, and
I can say, but speaking about multitasking.